Hi there, welcome to the second lesson of our tutorial series. In this lesson, we'll focus primarily on how to create intents and test conversational flows. By the end of this video, you should have a good grasp of how to create intents using best practices and how to test what flows are possible given a certain utterance from either the user or the application. Now let's continue where we left off, within our buttons conversation. We are almost at the bottom of the cascading conversational components needed to design a conversation. Now remember that in a conversation, there are at least two participants, and they interact with each other by exchanging utterances, and each utterance carries a specific intent. It contains the information that the user or the application needs to transmit to the other party. Turns contain a set of response and request intents. But in our particular case, we are going to be following a design pattern whereby we only have the request intents within our turns. This enables us to do cadence switches on transitions to have natural conversational flows. You can find out more on this in our documentation. Now let's take a look at our welcome turn that we created previously. We'll start by clicking on the Add Intent button over here. Next, we'll decide which participant should initiate a turn. In this case, it is the application as it is welcoming the user into the buttons conversation. Next, we'll give it a sample utterance, which is the phrase we use to remind us of what the content, the intent, is supposed to support in the conversational flow. In this case, we want to remind ourselves that this intent will describe buttons. Next, we'll give our intent a name. This is the more formal name used to refer to it through interpreters or in the message repository. In this case, we'll call ours Request Button Feature. Feel free to use whatever makes sense for you, but note that there are reserved intent names, so please check out our docs to ensure that you don't misuse them. Next, we have the behavior. Intents can have a completing behavior, which means that if the intent is matched, it will take us back to the top of the scenario and look for another way in through starting conversations, scenes, or turns. Next, we have transitions, which will help us transition to another conversation or scene if the intent is matched. So it will naturally look for an intent in there. Let's click on Save, and we've made our first intent. Okay, now that we've made our app request intent, let's take a look at the turn that contains the opposite participant, the user, and what possible intent the user may have. This is now where the next turn comes in. Remember from the previous lesson that this turn focuses on the navigation of the scenes. In our case, this will be where the user intents of what the user would like to navigate to would be. This would be to see button behaviors, button functionalities, or see other capabilities covered in the other conversations. Now, let's create these intents. We shall start with button functionalities. The participant shall be the user as mentioned earlier. Our sample utterance will be button functionalities. Our intent name will be select button functionalities. Now note that in this case, we have the option of selecting an interpreter and the associated confidence level. In this particular tutorial series, we will not be using any NLU as it is button driven, so the default interpreter is sufficient as it can handle buttons. This will not have a completing behavior, and this intent will transition the user to the button functionalities scene. Now we will apply the same logic to the other similar user intent, which would be select button behaviors. But in this case, the transition navigating to the button behaviors scene. Finally, within this turn, we have other capabilities. Still a user participant, but in our case, in terms of the sample utterance, we shall keep it other capabilities. And for the name, select other capabilities. Now for the transition. This will transition into the explore more turn. And that's it for the next intents. Now let's take a look at the Explore More turns intent. This serves the same function as the welcome turn, but allows us to tailor the message for someone that is already in the scene. In comparison to the welcome turn, which is the viewer's first encounter with the conversation, this is an app request intent. Our sample utterance will be other button features. Our intent name is Explore More. And that's it for the welcome user scenes, turns, and intents. Now let's move on to the button functionalities scene. Let's start with the turn with the starting behavior. Describe functionalities. Note that this turn is similar in function to the welcome turn we mentioned earlier. With regards to its intent, it is an app request intent. Our sample utterance will be describe button functionality, and the intent name is describe button functionality. Now for the URL button's turns intent. This shall be an app request intent, as it will be the application responding to the user's request to see the URL button. Our sample utterance will be show URL button, and the name will be show URL button. It shall not have a completing behavior because the user may want to interact with other turns within the scene, such as the simulating intents turn. Now for the simulating intents, turns, intent. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but note that this turns function is very similar to that of URL buttons, with the difference coming into play with the messaging. They both show the specific button functionality through the use of the appropriate message. Our sample utterance in this case will be show simulating intent button, and the name will be show simulating intent button. Now for our last turn that we will be focusing on again, the next turn. Note that this will have the same function as the next turn within our button's welcome user scene. It has user intents that navigate to the appropriate turns within the scene and to other scenes entirely using the default interpreter. Let's start with the select URL button intent with a sample utterance of URL button and using the default interpreter, and transition to the URL button's intent. Next, we have the select simulating intent button intent with a sample utterance of simulating intent button with transitions into the simulating intents turn. Finally, we have the show other features with a sample utterance of other button features and a transition set to the explore more turn within the welcome user scene. And that's it. We've completed the intents within the welcome user and button functionalities scene. Now, the same design pattern we use to make the button functionality scene should be used to make the button behavior scene. And that's it. You've created quite a number of intents. Now it's time to test them to see whether it all makes sense. Now, let's test conversational flow. The conversation simulator is the quickest way to test our different conversational flows based on your designs. It shows you what flows are possible given a certain utterance from either the user or the application. It is focused on flow and does not take into account interpretation or any conditions. To start, click on the play button within the action bar. Now choose an intent that the user could express to get the conversation started. Now, I would like you to select different intents and see whether you get the desired conversational flow. This will give you a good understanding of how the power of OpenDialog flow would be like before diving into actually setting up NLU or doing detailed messaging. And that's it. You've just built intents of turns in scenes of conversations that gives you the ability to design even more powerful conversations and how to test your conversational flows. In the next lesson, the final lesson, we look at creating messages and buttons.